economy to ransom. Because, Mr. Speaker, the impact of Iran's behaviour in the Strait is causing untold economic damage. It's visible on every petrol forecourt in the country. My guide from the start of this conflict has always been our national interest. That's why we stayed out of the war and why we continue to stay out of the war. And that is why we are working now to restore freedom of navigation in the Middle East, because that is squarely in our national interest. Now, Mr. Speaker, quite clearly, this is not a straightforward task. It will take time. I met UK businesses in energy, shipping, insurance and finance, and they are clear that vessels will not be put through the Strait until they are confident that it's safe to do so. And that's why we're working around the clock on a credible plan to reopen the Strait. And, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm today that together with President Macron, I will convene a summit of leaders this week to drive forward the international effort we have built in recent weeks, bringing together dozens of countries to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The summit will be focused on two things. First, diplomatic efforts to bring pressure to bear for a negotiated end to the conflict and for the Strait to be opened. Second, military planning to provide assurance to shipping as soon as a stable environment can be established. And let me be very clear, this is about safeguarding shipping and supporting freedom of navigation once the conflict ends. Our shared aim here is a coordinated, independent, multinational plan. This is the moment, Mr. Speaker, for clear and calm leadership. And notwithstanding the difficulties, Britain stands ready to play our part. Mr. Speaker, let me now return to the impact of this conflict on our economy. We all know that the consequences will be significant, but that they will last longer than the conflict itself. Now, we continue to monitor the effects, and I remind the House that energy bills went down on the 1st of April, and whatever happens in the Middle East, those bills will stay down until July. We're investing over £50 million to support heating oil customers, and fuel duty is frozen until September, all because of the decisions that this government took at the budget. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a wider point, because we can't stand here in this House and pretend that a global shock threatening to hit the living standards of British people is somehow a novel experience. Britain has been buffeted by crises for decades now, from the 2008 financial crash, through austerity, Brexit, COVID, the war that still rages in Ukraine, and the disastrous premiership of Liz Truss. The response each time has been to try to return to the status quo. A status quo, Mr. Speaker, that manifestly failed working people who saw their living standards flatline and their public services decimated. So this time, Britain's response must and will be different to reflect the changing world that we live in. That starts with our economic security, where during this conflict alone, we've capped energy bills, raised the living wage, strengthened workers' rights, and ended the two-child limit that will lift nearly 500,000 children out of poverty. But, Mr. Speaker, looking forward, it also means a closer economic relationship with our European allies, because Brexit did deep damage to the economy. And the opportunities we now have to strengthen our security and cut the cost of living are simply too big to ignore. It continues, Mr. Speaker, with our energy security, where I say once again, oil and gas will be part of our energy mix for decades to come. But, Mr. Speaker, we do not set the global price for oil and gas. And households across the country are fed up with international events beyond their control, pushing up their energy bills. And I stand with them on that. So we will go further and faster on our mission to make Britain energy independent, because that is the only way we get off the fossil fuel roller coaster and take control of our energy bills. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must strengthen our defence security. That means boosting our armed forces, as we have, with the biggest sustained investment since the Cold War. It means doubling down on the most successful military alliance the world has ever seen, the NATO alliance, of which this party in government was a founding member. But it also means strengthening the European element of that alliance, taking control of our continent's defence more robustly, deepening our partnerships, as we've done with our deals to build Norwegian frigates on the Clyde, Turkish Typhoons in Lancashire, not only, Mr. Speaker, creating thousands of secure jobs and opportunities for our defence industry right across the country, but also enhancing the way our armed forces can collaborate with our allies. Because, Mr. Speaker, as the Middle East conflict shows once more, the world in which we live has utterly changed. It is more volatile and insecure than at any period in my lifetime. And we must rise to meet it, calmly but with strength. That is exactly what we're doing at home and abroad. We are strengthening our security, taking control of our future, and building a Britain that is fair for all. And I commend the statement to the House.
Kevin Badenoch, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. I would also like to pay tribute to our brave servicemen and women serving in the Middle East right now. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right that Britain did not start this war, but whether we like it or not, we are impacted by it, and this is likely to get worse. The cost of borrowing has jumped, petrol prices are climbing, inflation is rising, and living standards falling. It is time to take decisive action in our national interest. Britain must focus on what is in our power to protect British citizens today. First, we must rapidly solve the energy crisis this war has caused in our country. And second, we must make sure that Britain is ready to defend herself in this new age. A nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat to the UK. We should be in no doubt whose side we're on in this war, our allies in the Middle East and the United States. So I welcome the Prime Minister meeting some of those allies, and I also welcome his support for diplomatic efforts and military planning to restore freedom of navigation in the region. But we will need to go further than just talking. He says Britain stands ready to play our part. We can all see that we were not ready for this situation. Here's what we need to do now. First, we must take rapid action to increase our energy security and keep bills down, not just until July, but longer than that, permanently. Britain is particularly vulnerable to energy price shocks because we are killing domestic oil and gas production in the North Sea. Labour's policy of more expensive energy and deindustrialization at this time of crisis is dangerous and irresponsible. It is also harming the defence industry. We must start drilling our own oil and gas in the North Sea, grant licenses for drilling in the Jackdaw and Rosebank fields, and restore British production before it is too late. The Prime Minister says this won't impact international prices. This is more than international prices. This is about the domestic supply, especially of gas, all of which is used in this country. Supply matters. And finally, the government must cancel the proposed rise in fuel duty. Hiking taxes on motorists for the first time in 15 years, while prices are surging, is a disgraceful decision. If Britain is to be a stronger country, it needs a stronger economy, not one being hammered by the highest energy prices in the developed world. So, Will the Prime Minister grant the oil and gas licenses and scrap the rise in fuel duty? I know he'll say that it's the Energy Secretary's job. The Energy Secretary is not the Prime Minister. He is. He can instruct him to grant those licenses. But, Mr. Speaker, secondly, to be ready, Britain must be able to defend herself. And that means we must be ready for these situations before they happen. France and Greece, they are. I don't know why they're laughing. I'm surprised they're laughing, because last time I checked, France and Greece sent ships to protect our bases in Cyprus while our destroyer was stuck in Portsmouth. It was a national embarrassment on their shoulders, and it should never happen again. We need no further evidence that we are living in a more dangerous world than a decade ago. I'm sure Labour MPs will try and think of a way to make this my fault. Let me remind them, yes, I know, it is preposterous, but let me remind them the historical illiteracy that is on those benches. Governments of all colours, including those guys there, spent the peace dividend from 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, until the Ukraine war. And when that war came, the Conservative government responded rapidly and unequivocally. We didn't have anything stuck in Portsmouth when Ukraine was invaded. We trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and equipped them with our missiles. We increased defence spending every year since the war started, but the world has since become even more dangerous. Every serious person, Mr. Speaker, every serious person, especially in the military, agrees that Britain must now find a way to spend 3% of GDP on defence by the end of this Parliament. After the election, many of the plans for spending were paused for Labour's strategic defence review. 9 months after publishing it, there is still no defence investment plan that explains how we will fund this. The Defence Readiness Bill is also nowhere to be seen. The question is not whether we need to increase defence spending. The question is what tough choices we must make to do so. That is what is missing from the government's plan. The government has a plan for welfare spending until 2031, but no plans for defence spending. So I say to the Prime Minister, let's put party interest aside. Yes. I'm glad that they're laughing, because I want the public to hear Labour MPs laughing when we say let's put party interest aside. So please keep laughing. Go on, please keep laughing. I say to the Prime Minister, let's find the money to rearm. Let's identify the spending cuts. And if we reach agreement on a joint plan, we can all support those measures in Parliament. Conservatives have already found savings to fund more than £20 billion extra for defence spending. I am willing to work with him to go further. And in his response, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Prime Minister will be tempted to misrepresent my position and pretend that I demanded he join in the initial strikes. Yes, I know they can't even resist the temptation. He and I both know that is not true. But let us get serious. Let's get serious. It is time for us to act decisively in our national interest. Let's show our allies what we bring to the table. Let's show our enemies that we are able and ready to defend ourselves. That requires a defence investment plan. So I ask the Prime Minister in conclusion, when exactly will the defence investment plan be published, and what action is he taking to find the money to pay for it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that her opening sentence has changed. She used to say, we didn't start the war, but like it or not, we're in it. And we should be in it. That was her position. Now she says, well, they can't make their mind up. They supported the war without thinking through the consequences, and now they're pretending they didn't support the war and they're against it all along. She challenged my position, and she did the mother of all U-turns on the most important decision the Leader of the Opposition ever has to take. Can I thank her for her support for the planning that we're doing with other countries? It is important. It has a number of components, the political and diplomatic component, the logistics as well in terms of getting the vessels through, where we're working with the sector, and of course the military component. We've been working on that for 2 or 3 weeks now, and now bringing together with President Macron the summit later this week in that regard. In relation to energy bills, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we all want to get energy bills down, and oil and gas will be part of the mix for many years. But it is because we're on the international market that our bills have gone up. And that is the problem. The Strait of Hormuz is a choke point for energy oil and gas getting to the international market. That's pushed the price up. That's being reflected in every household. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, the only way to take control of our energy bills is to go faster on energy independence. Now, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition used to make that argument. In 2022, she said this: it is investment in nuclear and renewables that will reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and keep costs down. She changes her mind on everything. That was her argument. And now just like she pretends she wasn't in favour of getting involved in the war, now she pretends she wasn't in favour of keeping costs down. And Mr. Speaker, she says that we must be ready. That's coming from a party that hollowed out our armed services. Mr. Speaker, on their watch, frigates and destroyers were reduced by 25%. Mine hunting ships reduced by 50% on their watch. And she lectures us about being ready, having hollowed out our armed forces and hollowed out our capabilities. We're investing 300 million more in shipbuilding, and we've got 13 ships on order. That, Mr. Speaker, is the difference between the two parties. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that she and they will forgive me. After 14 years of breaking everything under their watch, I'm going to resist the offer of joint planning from the government, from the party that crashed the economy, hollowed out our armed forces, crashed our public services. Thanks, but no thanks.
Chair of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Affairs Committee has just come from a meeting with some of the Gulf ambassadors, who are genuinely grateful for the help that Britain has given defending their countries, and who also want to say how grateful they are that the Prime Minister visited the Gulf in an act of true solidarity. But when people heard the Israeli Defense Minister say that his war aims in Lebanon would follow the model in Gaza, our blood ran cold. Could the Prime Minister tell the House what role the United Kingdom can do to ensure a ceasefire in Lebanon, and that Israel is stopped from taking over Lebanon south of the Litani River?
Raising the important question of Lebanon, I want to be really clear in relation to that. That should be included in the ceasefire, and we're using every opportunity we can to make that argument. And please, there's some diplomacy at the moment, but those attacks should stop, and it's really important we're very, very clear about that.
Democrats. Sir Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement, and can I join him in what he said about the horrific attack in Southport? Our thoughts with the families of Bibi, Elsie and Alice, and with all those affected. Mr. Speaker, a whole civilization will die tonight. Words I never thought I would hear from an American president. And though Donald Trump thankfully didn't follow through this time, these words are a stark reminder of how reckless, immoral, and completely outside the bounds of international law this president is. Regrettably, he is no friend of the United Kingdom. He is no leader of the free world. He is a dangerous and corrupt gangster, and that is how we must treat him. So will the Prime Minister advise the King to call off his state visits to Washington before it's too late? Because I really fear for what Trump might say or do while our King is forced to stand by his side. We cannot put His Majesty in that position. And when it comes to Trump's latest cunning plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, that will only escalate this crisis and jeopardize the precarious ceasefire. So it's right that the UK is not joining Trump. And I welcome the Prime Minister convening a summit to offer an alternative to Trump's. We must work with our reliable allies in Europe and the Commonwealth and our partners in the Gulf to bring this conflict to an end and keep open the Strait of Hormuz. That is critical for tackling the cost of living crisis that's getting worse and worse for people in the UK. With petrol prices now up by more than 25p a litre and diesel up 49p since Trump started this war, cheered on, let's not forget, by the leader of the Conservative Party and Reform, does the Prime Minister recognise that families and businesses can't wait months for the government to step in and help? So will he use the windfalls the Treasury is getting from higher fuel prices to cut the cost of living and keep the economy moving, with action to slash bus fares and rail fares and cutting fuel duty by 10p today, bringing down the price at the pumps by 12p a litre?
Can I thank him for his question? And in relation to the language about destroying a civilization, can I really be clear with this House? That was wrong. A threat to Iranian civilians in that way is wrong. These are civilians, let's remember, who've suffered immeasurable harm by the regime in Iran for many, many long years. And that's why they're words and phrases that I would never use on behalf of this government, which is guided by our principles and our values throughout all of this. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the King's visit, the relationship between our two countries is very important on a number of levels, and often what the monarchy is able to do through the bonds that they build is reach through the decades in a situation like this. And the purpose of the visit is to mark the 250th anniversary of the relationship between our country and the United States, and that's why the visit is going ahead. In relation to the blockade, let me be clear, as I've been already in the last day or so, that we are focusing our efforts on opening in full the Strait of Hormuz because of the damage it's doing to economies around the world, including our own economy. That is why we've been working with other countries at various levels, and we'll bring them together in a summit later this week. And we, the UK, will not be joining the blockade that the President announced. In relation to the help that is needed to families and households, obviously we've put in place help for energy bills already and oil heating that is in place. But, Mr. Speaker, we're keeping this under constant review as the situation evolves. The single most important and effective thing we can do is to de-escalate the situation and work with others to get the Strait of Hormuz open. And that is why we're focusing so much of our efforts in that regard.
Please sing Chair of the Select Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for confirming that despite the significant unwelcome trolling and pressure from President Trump and Israeli PM Netanyahu, that the UK is not being dragged into this war and it is not in our national interest. Given that the US has now initiated the blockade of Iranian ports, can the Prime Minister confirm what steps are being taken to help de-escalate the situation, whether it's to reopen the Strait of Hormuz so that goods can transit freely and that we can ease the cost of living pressures for our constituents, and also what is being done to help de-escalate the situation in Lebanon? And can you also confirm that any future UK involvement in the region will be strictly limited to defensive purposes only?
Well, can I thank him and reiterate that we will not be dragged into the war. In relation to the steps we're taking, they're across a number of levels. It was central to the discussions I had in the Gulf states last week in terms of what we can do together to de-escalate. Mr. Speaker, they are shocked and angry, frankly, that they have been attacked in the way that they have been attacked. They were not involved in the conflict, and it's clear to them that they were targeted within hours of the beginning of this conflict starting, and civilian infrastructure and civilians were targeted as well. And they're absolutely clear that that targeting was put in place before the conflict started. So we're working with them. We're working across the coalition of dozens of countries now to de-escalate and to get the Strait of Hormuz open just as soon as it's viable and credible to do so.
Of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
The Prime Minister may recall that on day one of this war, I supported his defensive attitude to it and said we couldn't change the regime from the air, and he agreed, he's been proved right. But with apologies to Leon Trotsky, we may not be interested in war, but war is interested in us. So we all agree we have to rapidly rearm. The trouble is that with the ever-increasing proportion of our entire economy taken by the state pension and by benefits, perhaps we can't afford to do it. So will you work with the Leader of the Opposition to take the necessary, perhaps unpopular decisions to return defence spending to what we spent in 1989, the end of the Cold War?
Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise this, and we already raised defence spending, as he knows, in the most significant way since the Cold War. I've been clear in the Munich Security Conference that I gave a few weeks ago that we need to go further and faster, and we will. I think in addition to the funding itself, I think it's really important that we take this opportunity to collaborate and cooperate with our partners, particularly in Europe, because if all European countries simply increase their spending without regard to the capability that they're using that spending on, we won't make the best of what we've got. And therefore, I'm making a dual argument, one in relation to the actual money we spend, but secondly, the way we need to collaborate in a way we haven't done, frankly, for decades in relation to this with our allies, particularly in Europe.
Nora Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's call for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire. 1,700 people have already been killed by Israeli attacks, and over 1.1 million people have been displaced at a time when aid budgets have been cut, including by our own government. Will the Prime Minister commit to playing that international leadership role, as he is doing in relation to getting a ceasefire, working with our European partners and others to support the humanitarian effort and increase support to those who are being displaced in the region, but also think about how we support countries in the global south that are now going to be hit very hard because of this crisis, because the impact of that will affect all of us if we don't take action at the international level.
Well, can I thank you for raising this really important issue and be clear, Lebanon must be included in the ceasefire, and it's very important that we are clear about the principle behind that. I also accept that there must be more support on the humanitarian front. We've just put more money into the humanitarian support, but it's clearly a cause of concern in Lebanon, actually, and in wider areas, as she rightly points out.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Prime Minister should acknowledge, I'm sure that he does, that over the last 30 years, our armed forces have been hollowed out by governments of all parties as they have sought to take a peace dividend. But I'm afraid the chickens have come home to roost on his watch. So will he now commit to a huge and immediate uplift in defence spending, not just by vaporising British soft power expenditure? We are talking of moving towards a 5% increase so that the government can play a full part in European defence and deliver on its first duty to its own citizens.
Well, I agree that our armed forces now capable is hollowed out over many years, in particular under the last government, I'm afraid to say. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, then Defence Secretary, was very clear about that. But he's right to say now is the point at which we've got probably more conflict going on in the world now than most of us have seen in our lifetimes. And that's why we have to increase defence spending. That's why we took the decision to increase to 2.5% sooner than people thought we would, and that's already taking place. I made commitments at the NATO summit last year in relation to the further spending that we need to put in place. I stand by those commitments. We must go further and we must go faster.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, let me say that thank you to the Prime Minister for your statesmanship. This weekend saw the Pakistani government step up and take global leadership by expertly hosting and mediating negotiation between Iran and America. The whole world is indebted to the noble efforts of Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar, and General Syed Asim Munir to achieve a ceasefire. Given Pakistan is a long-term ally of Britain, will the Prime Minister outline what support he is giving the Pakistani government facilitate an agreement for long-lasting peace and stability in the Middle East?
Can I reiterate my thanks to Pakistan for the role that they're playing? And I can tell the House that I spoke to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on Friday as we're going into the talks this weekend about the talks about what support we could put in place, and the Foreign Secretary spoke to her counterpart this afternoon. It's very important that we support this process and try to move it forward and not to let it escalate.
Stephen Flynn.
The Prime Minister is absolutely right to condemn the abhorrent response of the terrorists in the IRGC, but I noticed from his statement that there's no explicit condemnation of the illegality of Donald Trump's actions. There's no explicit condemnation of the illegality of Netanyahu's actions. And despite having the entire Easter break to think about it, there is explicitly no new financial support for households on these isles whatsoever, despite the fact that in Ireland, they've put down €750 billion worth of support for motorists and farmers. The best he can muster is to continue to monitor the effects. Now, I appreciate that he might not be in office for very much longer, but whilst he is, the public expect him to provide support. Why isn't he?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll remind him that we put in support and protection for our citizens in the region by taking defensive action. He opposed that. Protection for Scottish citizens in the Gulf, and they opposed taking any action whatsoever. It is only because we've stabilised the economy we're able to reduce energy bills. What did they do? They voted against the budget in which we put forward the money for this. So we will carefully do the work that we need to do, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which is the single most effective thing we can do in relation to household costs, and to work for de-escalation. I would have thought that he would have supported that, but unfortunately, again, he's on the opportunistic road rather than up the road to support what we really need to do.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I thank my right honourable friend for all that he's doing towards de-escalating the conflict in the Middle East, and also to agree with him in terms of not getting drawn into this conflict. But could I ask him about Palestine, and particularly the West Bank? Does my right honourable friend agree with more than 30 former UK ambassadors that any bidder for contracts to design, build or finance the E1 settlement expansions should endanger their business interests in and with the UK?
Well, Clyde, thank you for raising this, and it's very important that we don't lose focus on what's happening in the West Bank. It is deeply concerning and deeply worrying. And in relation to the E1 settlements, I made the position clear, I think, the week before last, and that remains the position.
Sir Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a crisis, governments have permission to do things that are not possible in normal times. But I'm worried that what the Prime Minister is going to bring forward will not meet the measure of the moment. Can he commit to the House that when it comes to energy policy, he will dramatically change it so that it focuses as much on cheap energy as clean energy? And when it comes to the desperate need to increase defence spending, will he look at serious welfare reform that stops someone who is earning the national living wage working full-time, sometimes only getting half as much as someone on the three main benefits?
Can I thank him for his question? In relation to the cost of energy, yes, of course, we have to focus on the cost of energy. And there's simply no denying the fact that it's because we're on the international market that our energy prices are going up and down. And families across the country are really fed up with the fact that international events happen, which they can't control, and their energy bills go up and down, causing a cost of living crisis. That is because we're on the international fossil fuel market. There's no denying that. And that will be the case so long as we're on that market, because that controls the price. Putin and Iran control the price of the international market, and the longer we're on it, the more our families will be subjected to that. We have to take control of energy bills. The only way to do that is through energy independence. It's the only way to do it, and that's why I think we need to double down on going faster and further in relation to that. Yes, Yes, of course, oil and gas will be part of the mix for many years to come. Been very clear about that, but equally clear that that won't have an effect on the price and the cost of energy bills. The only thing that will have an effect on the price and cost of bills is coming off the international market that we're stuck with. That's why the Strait of Hormuz is so important. We don't get that much energy in oil and gas coming out of or coming through the Strait, but it's because we're on the international market that we're impacted by the fact that others do. That is the source of the problem. That's why we're working so hard to resolve it.
John Trickett.
Sir, and can I echo the comments about the President's statement on Easter Sunday, that in an evening he could destroy a 2,500-year-old civilization. But on the question of the Straits of Hormuz, isn't it clear that the Straits were open before the President foolishly launches a legal war? And can I ask the Prime Minister to say quite clearly that no British military assets or brave personnel would be put at risk in a foolish idea to blockade the Straits even further, which came from the President yesterday?
Thank you for that. It is, of course, Iran that's putting in the chokehold on the Strait. That is wrong, and the strength of feeling across the Gulf last week was very, very clear to me. I can assure him that we are not getting involved in the proposal to blockade the Strait. On the contrary, we're working with other countries to try and get the Strait open and fully open for free navigation, something this country has championed for years and years and years.
Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the US President impersonated Jesus Christ. Last week, he pledged to wipe out an entire civilization. His warmongering in the Middle East is piling on the pressure for my constituents in Esher and Walton, from prices at the pump to mortgage increases in the midst of a cost of living crisis. So given the disturbing utterances from the occupant of the White House and the squeeze on our living standards, surely the future is across the channel towards Europe. And I note that the Prime Minister gave a line, presumably for the local elections, about alignment with Europe. But could he give more detail on what this means for defence and for security and for prosperity?
Well, a close relationship with the EU and Europe was in our manifesto in 2024, which was a very successful manifesto. And we've been working to that end ever since, which is why we had the first UK EU summit last year with agreed 10 strands. It's why I've been clear that we want to go further this year, not just in seeing where we've got to on what we've already agreed, but going further than that, because it is in our interest, whether it's defence, security, energy or the economy, to be closer to Europe, and that's what we're endeavouring to do.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and welcome his convening of a summit of leaders alongside President Macron. Mr. Speaker, the situation in Lebanon is devastating. Israeli escalation has led to a grave humanitarian situation. The images of civilians being carpet bombed are horrifying. I want to reiterate what the Foreign Affairs Committee heard today. We met with ambassadors from the Gulf. They expressed their genuine appreciation for the Prime Minister's presence and Britain's continuing support. Can I ask the Prime Minister to continue to represent the voices of our constituents and to resist escalation, include Lebanon in the ceasefire, and to press for peace?
Can I assure her we'll make the case for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire, and we will continue with our work to de-escalate and not get drawn into this war?
Dick Moulton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we all hear the Prime Minister's words about Lebanon, but surely the lesson of the last 2.5 years is that his words and the words of anybody in this House have no impact on an Israeli government seemingly led by supremacist maniacs. Now, before Easter, I asked the Foreign Secretary how many Lebanese was an acceptable number to see killed over the coming weeks, and we've learned over the Easter break that there's seemingly no upper limit before we're willing to act. So I wanted to ask the Prime Minister a simple question. Given that he proudly, quite rightly, proudly pointed to the part Britain is playing in defending other nations in the region, why have we not stepped forward to defend Lebanese civilians in the same way that we have others? And secondly, a simple question, if you can't answer that one, does Lebanon have a right to exist?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to him for raising this really serious issue, and I think the immediate focus has to be ensuring that Lebanon is in the ceasefire and being absolutely clear in our condemnation of the action that Israel is taking. We are working on that on a number of levels, but I always believe and continue to believe that we are stronger when we work with other countries, and that's what we're endeavouring to do.
Holly Billington.
Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his statement, and I note the emphasis he has on the no return to the status quo, particularly in relation to the importance of energy independence. Will he acknowledge that we are now entering a new energy era? And perhaps he agrees with President von der Leyen, who today has said, here is one thing that all these events are making clear. We are paying a very high price for our over-dependency on fossil fuels. And the grim reality for our continent is fossil fuel energy will remain the most expensive option in the years to come.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's the argument that I've been making, and I believe to be right. It's the argument the Leader of the Opposition used to make, but she's U-turned on that as well.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All our constituents are worried about the price of energy, the price of gas. But is the Prime Minister aware that the price of gas in the US has fallen 20% since the start of this war, while the price of gas in the UK has increased by 50%, proving, Prime Minister, that if we produce and consume our gas domestically, we can have much lower bills, proving why we must allow the consents for Jackdaw, for Rosebank, and all of the oil fields across the North Sea and onshore as well.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I remind myself that his party's position was to fully support the war, go in with both feet, whatever the consequences. Now he says there are these consequences. Well, they should have thought about that before they adopted the policy of going straight in. But, Mr. Speaker, on the question of energy and gas, yes, the price is subject to the international market because we're on the international market. That is why the sooner we have energy independence, the better.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Trump's illegal war on Iran and his genocidal threats to kill a whole civilization are part and parcel of a dangerous new US security plan. The Trump doctrine is based upon yet more war and tearing up international law, making the whole world less safe. Prime Minister, given that, isn't it time for Britain to stop being a junior partner to the US and pursue a truly independent foreign policy? And should the very first step be to end all US access to British military bases for Trump's war on Iran?
We have British civilians in the Gulf region, about 300,000, and they are at risk because of Iran's actions, and it's my duty to ensure that we protect them. That is why we've taken action in our own right, particularly with our pilots. It is also why I've allowed the bases to be used for defensive purposes to prevent those attacks on our civilians as much as anything else who are in the region. And I'm never going to abandon them to their fate when there is incoming missiles and drones into the areas where they are living and where they are working. It's my duty to protect them, and I'll continue to do so.
Sir Berninger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Prime Minister just remind some of his colleagues that the United States is a democracy and an ally, and Iran is an odious regime that could have ended the war this weekend had they agreed to give up their ambitions for nuclear weapons and to cease supporting their proxy terrorist organisations around the Middle East? And wouldn't it be helpful if the Prime Minister said a bit more of criticism of the Iranian regime rather than supporting his colleagues and criticising the United States?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in fairness, I've been very clear about the Iranian regime. It is odious, as he rightly points out. It is really important that they do not have the nuclear capability and that we deal with their proxies. And that has been the consistent position of this government and previous governments, to be fair. And it's been the way in which I put it from the dispatch box on many, many occasions.
Mr. Hamid Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister for his efforts to keep the UK out of Donald Trump's latest dangerous attempt to end a blockade by creating another. I also commend Pakistan's attempt to broker peace and the UK government's work with now over 30 countries to pursuit of a diplomatic solution. But if the strait remains closed, what plans does the government have to protect UK households and businesses from impact on energy supplies, trade and rising costs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're planning for all contingencies, but I emphasise once again that our absolute focus has to be on getting the Strait open. Having spoken to shipping, finance, insurance, etc., they're very clear with me that they're not going to be putting vessels through whilst there is a conflict, and therefore we must de-escalate and come up with that credible plan. We will do that in conjunction with other countries, and that's why President Macron and I are convening the summit later this year, later this week, building on the work we've been doing over the last few weeks.
Mr. Speaker, in its statement, the Prime Minister said that he wanted to double down on NATO, but President Trump has attempted to use the NATO alliance or threat to withdraw from it to blackmail other NATO countries into joining his illegal endeavour in Iran. He's also threatened to annex the sovereign territory of another NATO member. He has said that NATO members weren't there for the US in Iraq. It is clear that the US is an unreliable partner in NATO. So will the Prime Minister announce when he is going to release the defence investment plan, and will he explain how we can forge closer ties with our European allies who are more reliable?
Mr. Speaker, let me thank you for his question. And the first thing I'd say is it's very important that we defend NATO. It's the single most effective military alliance the world has ever known, and we should do nothing to weaken it. I do think that there should be a stronger European element on defence and security. It's an argument I've been making for some time. It's particularly important now that Europe steps up with a stronger European element, and we're working with our allies to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and his positive efforts on the issue of the Straits of Hormuz. Last week, I met with farmers in Whitby who are deeply concerned about the skyrocketing price of red diesel. In January, the fuel cost was 64 pence per litre, and it has since doubled. With the busiest period of the farming calendar approaching, can the Prime Minister outline what measures the government is considering to support farmers impacted by these rising costs?
Can I assure her that we have been looking at that in the various meetings we've been having, particularly the red diesel question, and looking at contingencies. But in addition to planning for those contingencies, it is really important that we double down on our work to de-escalate and to open up the Strait of Hormuz.
Tom Tugendhat. Mr. Speaker, may I quote the Prime Minister, who told us just a few moments ago that the bills for energy are going to stay down until July, but he also correctly said that we do not set the global price for oil and gas. Is the Prime Minister making an enormous gamble on the energy price, and how much money has he set aside in order to ensure that bills stay down even if prices rise? I'm not sure if he's aware, but the last tanker to leave the Strait of Hormuz and bring fuel to the UK docked only a few days ago. The last tanker to arrive in the US waters will be arriving in a day or two, and after that we're on our own. Is he taking that bet, and who's going to pay for it?
Can I thank him for reminding the House that we are reducing energy bills. We have done that already by an average £100 per household, and that will stay. That will remain the case until the end of June, until July of this year. It's very important that people hear that message because they are concerned, and they're concerned to know that that will be the case whatever happens in the conflict, and it is. That decision was taken as a result of what we did at the budget last year, where we were able to stabilise the economy and provide the money for it, because we're bearing down on the cost of living.
Paul Ward. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for refusing to allow the UK to be dragged into America's war in Iran, a war that's hitting my constituents directly in the pocket and at the petrol pumps. But he rightly mentioned the people of Palestine earlier. And can I remind him that last week, the former heads of Shin Bet and Mossad security services and former IDF chiefs of staff described the ongoing settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank as, I quote, government-sponsored Jewish terrorism, which is not only a moral disgrace, but a fatal strategic blow to Israel's own national security. So can I urge the PM to condemn the settler violence, condemn Israel's refusal to tackle it, condemn Israel's expansion of illegal settlements, and also to back the Pope, who said that peace should be the priority?
Can I thank him for raising the question of settler violence, because it is disturbing, it is wrong, and it's escalated, as he knows better than most, and that's been our clear position, to call it out and to do everything we can in relation to that settler violence, which is getting worse by the day, not better by the day.
Mike Martin.
The crisis has laid bare the parlous state of the British military, and, Madam Deputy Speaker, the three main parties of government should put aside the blame game and accept that we all have played our part in getting the British military into the state that it's in now. For over a year, the Liberal Democrats have been asking for cross-party talks on how to get to 3%. I'm glad the Conservatives have now joined us. We've spoken about defence bonds. I'm sure the Conservatives have got ideas. I'm sure the government has ideas. Can we please, Madam Deputy Speaker, this could be the Prime Minister's legacy. Can we please get together in the national interest and talk about how to increase defence spending?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do need to increase defence spending. I've been clear about that. But can I just make the case that our military have been hard at work throughout this conflict from within about 2 hours of the conflict starting. That means hours and hours of the pilots taking incoming missiles to safeguard our citizens, our interests, and those in the Gulf. And when I was there last week, all of the leaders I met were at pains to thank us for what our military is doing. And we're too quick sometimes to run them down. They've done a lot of brave work, particularly in the last 6 to 7 weeks, and I thank them for that work.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for all his efforts, not least, of course, in the last few days. I'm a little concerned that because many of us have a difference with the way President Trump talks and the actions he's taken in terms of Iran, and obviously something we don't agree with on this side of the House, I am a little concerned that we shouldn't get mixed up in the fact between what President Trump says and his view and what the Congress and Senate think in the United States of America. Because when you talk to them, there is significant and overwhelming support for NATO and for Europe. And I think it's important we actually remember that, because our relationship in America is very, very important, not least in terms of NATO. And I hope that the Prime Minister will comment on that.
Can I thank him for that? And he's right to draw attention to the broad support there is for NATO in the United States, and always has been. And whilst it is true we should do more for a stronger European element in NATO, we should never pull away from NATO, which, as I say, has been the single most effective military alliance the world has ever known.
Afra Brandreth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The war in the Middle East is having a real effect on my constituents in Chester South and Eddisbury. From fuel to fertiliser, prices are increasing and action needs to be taken to alleviate the consequences. While there are immediate steps that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor should be taking, not least reversing the planned increase in fuel duty, the bigger picture involves reopening the Strait of Hormuz. What thought has been given to the role the UK can play in clearing the Strait of mines? And in particular, did the Prime Minister raise the potential deployment of our autonomous minesweeping capabilities, which are already in the region, during his discussions? Prime Minister.
Can I thank her for her question? She's absolutely right in relation to opening the Strait and playing our part. There is the political and diplomatic element, but there is also the military capability. What we're doing with the countries that we've brought together in a loose coalition and will meet in person later this week is to look across those capabilities and draw them together. We do have capabilities when it comes to minesweeping. I won't go into operational details, but she knows what they are. And obviously, as we look across the board with President Macron and others, part of that exercise will be, and the military planners have been looking at this, to look at how we can pull together the capabilities of all the countries that are prepared to work with us on this. We've got at least a couple of dozen that we've been working with for the last 2 weeks, and we'll be doing that further this week.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's leadership in supporting our regional partners and our national interests, in particular that of free navigation. But this lies out with our most immediate security problem, which is defending Europe from Russian attack in all of its forms. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we should recognise Russian-Iranian cooperation and that we must not let this distract from our urgent need to collectively rearm and defend our country and the continent of Europe?
Well, can I thank him for drawing attention to this really important issue, which is the relationship between Russia and Iran and the assistance that Russia has given to Iran in relation to the intelligence that's being used during the conflict. And we must never lose sight of the fact that we're facing a war on two fronts, and Russia is a huge threat to our continent and to our country.
Lincoln Job.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Will the defence investment plan be signed before the local elections on the 7th of May?
Mr. Speaker, we're working to finalise the defence investment plan. It's really important that we don't make the mistakes the last government made. We inherited plans which were unfunded and not deliverable, and it's really important, therefore, that our plan is robust. We're finalising it, but it will be a robust plan that serves for the future defence and protection of this country.
Yasmin Qureshi. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We now know that an agreement was about to be reached on the uranium enrichment by Iran. However, Israel decides to bomb Iran, as did the USA, joining and doing an illegal, immoral, dangerous war of choice. And even during the ceasefire, which included Lebanon, Israel continues to bomb South Lebanon and Beirut, displacing millions of people. This is typical of Israel. Just before an agreement is reached, it kills negotiators and bombs the countries. Now, these are not faraway conflicts. My constituents of Bolton South and Walkden are paying the price for it by higher fuel costs, raising mortgages and household bills. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what additional steps is he taking to help the constituents of my area, but also the country and the world to bring peace, unlike, of course, members opposite who seems to be finding it very amusing?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is precisely why we're working with other countries to de-escalate the situation and get the Strait of Hormuz open. As I said in my statement, that is not going to be easy, but notwithstanding that challenge, we'll continue to do so.
Any chance?
Deputy Speaker, in the Prime Minister's 17-page statement, there was not one word of condemnation of the actions of the US, despite the fact that they started this illegal war and that last week Trump threatened to wipe out an entire civilization. Now, the Prime Minister did rightly condemn the horrific Israeli attacks on Lebanon, but we all know that the war criminal Netanyahu just ignores what we say because there are no consequences. So will the Prime Minister take action, sanctions on Netanyahu, withdraw all permission for the US to use UK bases and UK airspaces to make clear that we will not be an accomplice to the rogue actions of Donald Trump, which endanger us all?
The US are using the basis to attack the Iranian capability to fire missiles into the region, including at our citizens and our nationals. You'll have seen the images going into hotels, going to the bases where our military are based. Is she seriously suggesting that we should reduce the protection for our people in the region and expose them to attacks they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to? That, to me, is a dereliction of duty, and I will never do that.
John McDonnell.
I actually think the House is at one with the Prime Minister with regard to the inclusion of Lebanon in the ceasefire. The problem that we face is that today there's been more airstrikes against the Lebanese, and the Israeli artillery are now shelling Lebanese cities and towns. And for many of us, we feel it is because Netanyahu actually is out of control, and Donald Trump is not willing to exert that control or influence to bring him into line. So can I suggest to the Prime Minister, in his next discussions with the European leaders that he's successfully convening, can he place on the agenda now a comprehensive European sanctions strategy so that we can exert some influence on preventing Netanyahu, as I say, running out of control and actually creating problems for the globe, not just the Middle East?
Can I thank him for his question? And clearly Lebanon should be included in the ceasefire. And let's be clear, these attacks must stop, and we need to be really clear about that. And we will work with our allies on both those issues.
Then obviously, JT.
Okay. We know that the Defence Investment Plan was originally due to be published last year. As it's a 10-year plan, will it be a 10-year plan from publication in this financial year, 2026-27? And does that change the cost envelope? Is it a 10-year plan now or a 9-year plan in terms of the way it's being financed?
Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm so sorry. It's a 10-year plan, and it mirrors our strategic review. But of course, obviously, it sits alongside the defence spending commitments that we have made and we're implementing with the 2.5% and the commitments that I made at the NATO summit last year.
Absala Begum.
The House has repeatedly been told that the government has permitted the US to use British military bases for defensive purposes only. But amidst the widespread US targeting of civilian infrastructure in Iran, including schools, hospitals and bridges, we have not been told how these restrictions work in practice. Could the Prime Minister confirm whether the US military aircraft have taken off from RAF Fairford or Lakenheath carrying heavy munition payloads? If so, whether there is any US operational policy for action from our bases in place approved by this government? And if not, is it the case that the working definition of defensive action here is simply don't ask, don't tell?
Well, let me assure her in the House that isn't the position. It's for defensive action only. I'm particularly concerned to make sure we take every measure available to protect our nationals in the region, and very many of them. Not only is it defensive action, but it's monitored and has been monitored since the bases began being used.
Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister is absolutely right to suggest that the tremors provoked by this conflict will reverberate long after the kinetic fighting has finished. And there's perhaps no greater example of that than in Cyprus, where government officials, all the way up to the level of the Prime Minister, have questioned Britain's continuing sovereignty over our sovereign base areas in Cyprus. So can I ask the Prime Minister what he has done to reassure the Cypriots, to reassure the Cypriot government that Britain is a trusted and reliable neighbour and partner, and that our continuing sovereignty is immutable?
Can I thank him for raising this and assure him I've spoken to the President a number of times in this regard about the basis, about security in particular, which is of course a concern to him and his public, and those discussions are ongoing.
Conor Naismith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This war, which we are rightly playing no part in, has my constituents fearing for the future, not least in terms of rising energy and fuel costs. And this underlines the crucial importance of bringing down the cost of energy and securing energy independence. But will the Prime Minister reassure my constituents in Crewe and Nantwich that while this government is rightly taking the necessary steps to provide us with long-term energy security through renewable energy and new nuclear, that the government will go further in the short term to tackle some of the profiteering that is happening and to directly support hard-pressed families and small businesses in my constituency with the cost?
Yes, we will bear down on any profiteering at the same time as pushing forward at speed for energy independence.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much. I'd ask the Prime Minister about one particular consequence of this war in the Middle East, and that's the rising costs of heating oil, diesel and petrol. Now, everyone is struggling. I've spoken to many businesses and people who are really struggling to pay their bills, but the UK government and the Scottish government support is only for people claiming benefits. So when will the government reconsider this approach and ensure that everybody, working people and businesses, are also getting sufficient support as well?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we'll set out the plans as they develop. Some of the ways in which we protect and support has to be universal, and in fact the cut in energy bills that's through to the end of June is universal. But we're looking at the most appropriate support on a wider basis.
Dame Chiunwara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Fresh from a weekend knocking on doors, I can confirm to the Prime Minister that on the streets of Newcastle Central and West, there is no appetite for further involvement in this war. Now, there are some, including apparently the leader of the opposition, who say that while they might not have chosen to start the war, now that the bombs are flying, we have no choice but to support our allies. So can the Prime Minister confirm that President Trump's America is not a reliable ally, that the Prime Minister Netanyahu's Israel is not a reliable ally, and that we have to work with our reliable allies in Europe to end this conflict and ensure that working people in this country do not pick up the bill?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we work with Americans on a daily basis on defence, security and intelligence. It's really important that I reiterate that position to the House. And of course, we're working with them in relation to the use of our bases to take the action that's necessary to protect our civilians and our nationals. At the same time, we need to work more closely with our European allies on defence, security, on energy and on the economy.
Ben Lake.
The Prime Minister was right to mention the untold economic damage that this crisis has already wrought on households and businesses across the country due to increased fuel costs. But does he also share my concerns and those of the agricultural sector that a prolonged closure of the Strait may also feed through to higher food inflation? And can I ask him what measures the government is considering to help mitigate the potential consequences of a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz?
Can I thank him for drawing attention to that, because there will be consequential impacts beyond the immediate impact on energy. And that's why we're monitoring, keeping under review the steps that we can take. But I go back to my opening point, really, which is the absolute focus has to be on getting the Strait reopened as quickly as possible, because all the time that is closed to free navigation, the damage that's being done is being compounded. And that's why it's really important that we work with our allies to that end.
Justin Matters.
Madam Deputy Speaker, last week President Trump was making the most outrageous and dire threats in order to try and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. This week he wants to keep it shut. So I wonder if the Prime Minister can shed any light on what the United States strategic objective is behind this latest move. What can be done to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and what this government can do more to protect our people from the economic consequences of this mess.
Let me be clear, I want the Strait open, not shut. And that is what we've been working on for the last few weeks and will continue to work on. And that's why when I spoke to President Macron yesterday, we proposed pulling together a leaders level summit later this year to continue the work we're already doing. But to be very clear with him in the House, that is to keep the Strait, or to get the Strait fully open, because that is the single most effective way to limit the damage that is being done to all of our economies.
Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the Prime Minister was in the Middle East, did the subject of the UK's dependence on helium come up? Because it is an element which we don't produce in the UK and is vital for things like MRI scans in the NHS.
Well, we did discuss a range of issues. I won't go into all of the details, but we did agree that where we're working together already, we should double down and do even more in relation to resilience in particular, which goes to her question, both economically and defensively, and we'll take forward that work.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I welcome the Prime Minister's continued clarity on the need for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire. But Israel's tactics in Lebanon, forced displacement, evacuation orders, 165 children killed and 87 medical workers killed, are straight out of their Gaza playbook. Does the Prime Minister agree that in Lebanon, as in Palestine, there must be proper accountability for these war crimes, because this age of impunity puts us all in greater danger?
Well, I'm grateful for her question. It absolutely shows why we must keep pushing for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire. It's vitally important that we do so. And of course, there must be accountability for all the actions that are taken in any respect in this conflict.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been overwhelmed at the number of my constituents in Edinburgh West who've written to me over the past 2 weeks about the situation in the Gulf. They are, of course, concerned about their energy bills and the cost of living, but overwhelmingly, they are outraged at the actions of all the actors in this: Iran, Israel, and the United States. And what they want from their government is more and stronger leadership on the international stage to open the Straits of Hormuz. So will the Prime Minister consider going to the United Nations with an emergency motion to the Security Council to get that done and to condemn the actions in the Middle East?
Well, as she probably knows, we have been supporting measures in the UN over the last 2 weeks, particularly some of those that were put forward by our Gulf allies, and I had the opportunity to discuss those last week in the Gulf. We will continue to work with them and others on building the necessary coalition to do all that we can to get the Strait open.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I welcome the tough stance of the Prime Minister in response to the demands of President Trump to get involved in this conflict, and his commitment that Lebanon must be part of the ceasefire. Our constituents need us to give them hope that they will not have to continue to live in a world which is driven by the uncertainty of when the White House takes to Truth Social. We can do things to de-escalate conflict, and one of those things is to support the two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, which he knows is at the heart of much uncertainty in the Middle East. Given that the conduct of the settlers on the West Bank directly undermines the possibility of peace and the possibility of a Palestinian state, will he commit to including their conduct in his conversations about the ceasefire and how we can give hope to people in the Middle East and peace to people around the world?
Can I reiterate to her in the House our support for the two-state solution as the only way for a viable long-term peace in the region? And, of course, the settler violence is a threat to that. It's wrong in principle. In addition to that, we'll continue to bear down on it.
Rick Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. For years, well before this conflict took place, members from all sides of this House have called on the government of the day to prescribe the IRGC. Whether it's been the Prime Minister answering or other ministers, there has always been a pivot to economic sanctions against the IRGC. We know that the Iranian regime have found ways through cryptocurrency and fake corporate structures to evade those sanctions. So what assessment has the Prime Minister made of the effectiveness of UK sanctions against Tehran? And on the presumption that those sanctions are failing, what precise action is he going to take to strengthen them?
Can I thank him for his questions? The IRGC has been sanctioned in its entirety. In relation to what more we can do, obviously, we've been looking at state-based threats, which will almost certainly require legislation. He will be familiar with the review in that regard. So I think there are further things that we can do, and hopefully we can work across the House on some of those issues.
Liam Conlon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's clear now there was no plan behind this reckless war, and the resulting energy crisis is going to have huge impacts, both here in the UK and around the world. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his cool-headed approach in the face of pressure from the leaders of Reform and the Conservatives to follow the US blindly into this war? And does the Prime Minister also agree with me that it demonstrates how important it is that we finally get off the fossil fuel roller coaster and continue our record investment in green energy?
Thank you on both fronts. It was very important from the start that we made clear that we wouldn't be playing any part in this war, not least because of the consequences. And what the war has flushed out is the need to get off the international market and to have independence of energy bills in this country.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, British drones flew over Lebanon hours before and after the Israeli massacre, which killed at least 18 people in Bekaa Valley City, among 300 people across the region that day. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know no UK drones and surveillance flights have been used to feed operational information to the IDF during the genocide in Gaza, and it is deeply concerning that this may now be the case in Lebanon. Will the Prime Minister confirm if these flights were coordinated with the Lebanese army? Was intelligence shared with Israel or with the United States? What is our armed forces' role in this land grab and ethnic cleansing? And have any weapons supplied by the UK to Israel been used in Lebanon?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been clear throughout, and I'll be clear with him. This government is guided by the principle that any action we take anywhere in the world must have a lawful basis, and that's the principle I've applied throughout this conflict and throughout the time this government has been in power.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I commend the Prime Minister and also the leadership from the Foreign Secretary and also the NSA, I'm sure, in the work that's being done. I welcome the news about trying to resolve the issues in the Strait of Hormuz. But I share concerns that have been voiced around the chamber here about the situation in Lebanon and also the West Bank. But closer to home, the Resolution Foundation has quoted that median working age households will be hit by £480 additional cost this year. What they're describing in my constituency is the cost of Trump. So will the Prime Minister explain more about what can be done to assist households here in the UK?
Well, the single most important thing is to de-escalate and get the Strait of Hormuz open. And that's why we're working so hard with other countries in order to do so, because the impact that it's having on our economy, and undoubtedly is affected by how long the strait remains closed for, and that's why we have to focus on that.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The price of energy is obviously important, but as important is the security of supply. And whether the government like it or not, over 70% of our energy comes from oil and gas. And the events of the last month must be a wake-up call to them that we must secure our supply. Luckily, we do have a secure supply under the North Sea. But, and although his government ministers might say otherwise, his government's policies are meaning that we cannot produce it. When is he going to get serious about our energy security and end the ban on new licences, end the EPL, permit Rosebank and Jackdaw, and finally get the UK drilling again?
Mr. Speaker, oil and gas will be part of the mix for many years to come. I've been very clear about that. Oil and gas is being produced 24/7 every day in relation to our energy supply, and it's really important that it does. That will be part of the mix. But equally, if we're to get to energy independence, which we need to go further and faster on renewables.
Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and commend his leadership in steering the UK clear from the Iran conflict and blockade. During this war, healthcare centres, hospitals and ambulances have been attacked, and the Iranians now face acute shortages of care and medicines. What action is the Prime Minister taking to press all parties to comply with international humanitarian law and end the attack on healthcare infrastructure?
Madam Deputy Speaker, let me be really clear. Any attack on healthcare infrastructure is completely unacceptable, and that is why we've been very clear in relation to our own actions and the actions of anybody else. They must have a lawful basis, and that's the starting point for all of the work that we're doing.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister rightly in his statement referred to defence security and energy security, but he made no reference to food security, which feels like a glaring omission given the impact of the doubling of red diesel on the farmers who produce our food. And I wonder if he's even aware that, outrageously, England is now the only country in the UK and in the whole of Europe that does not use its farm payment scheme to actively support its farmers to produce food. In these troubled times, does he agree with me now that's a glaring omission also? Will he turn around and change it?
Thank you for raising this. Food security is really important. I mean, it actually comes under energy security in a sense, because it's the energy costs that are pushing or could have the effect of pushing in relation to food security. And that's why it's very important that we do focus where we are focusing on, which is de-escalating the situation and reopening the Strait of Hormuz.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Resorting to violence doesn't achieve anything but has left 2,000 Lebanese dead and 1.2 million displaced. And as the Prime Minister is demonstrating, bilateral, multilateral dialogue is the way forward to get progressive change. Instead of just looking at increasing the defence budget, would he also look at increasing investment in diplomacy and development, which is really crucial in this ever-increasing destabilised world?
Can I thank her? I think that the work we're doing with other countries has to start with the political and the diplomatic. Of course, we're looking at military planning, but you can't have military planning without the diplomacy, because it's absolutely clear to me that the Strait of Hormuz will not allow for safe passage until there's a ceasefire in place, and all of the sectors involved in vessels going through the strait are clear that they won't be putting their vessels through until that is the situation. So she's absolutely right about diplomacy.
Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is absolutely correct to praise the service of our armed forces personnel, and I join him in doing so, but they are being let down by the failure to deliver the defence investment plan. That failure can only be the result of either inertia or incompetence within government. Which one is it?
Speaker, I remind, they hollowed out the armed forces. They reduced they hollowed out the armed forces. They didn't increase defence spending. The last time we were at 2.5% was under the last Labour government. Now we're under this Labour government. So I appreciate all the advice, but after 14 years of failure, I don't really need that advice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
From Iran to Russia, the major security threats we face are pan-European challenges, and the Prime Minister's referenced the need and our intention to work more closely with our European allies within NATO. Can you set out what more we can do to be ambitious with those allies on the continent to strengthen our defence and security partnerships, especially in the run-up to the EU-UK summit in the summer?
Well, I'm grateful. I do think there's more we can do on defence and security, particularly collaborating, cooperating about the particular capability in addition to the amount of money we're spending. And that's what we're focusing on with our allies in the EU.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain's military cooperation with the USA and Israel has enabled Israel to commit acts of genocide against the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people, and has enabled the United States to undertake this massive illegal bombardment of Iran. Could he assure the House that from now on, the military cooperation and supply of weapons and parts to both Israel and the United States will be suspended whilst this appalling war goes on in Iran, which is a danger, not just to the peace of the whole region, but clearly a danger to the peace of the whole world?
Can I assure him and the House that the permission to use our bases is strictly for defensive purposes, and in particular to protect our nation, nationals who are in the region. We've got 200,000 or 300,000 of our nationals in the region. Iranian strikes were coming into the region, into the Gulf states that I visited last week, hitting infrastructure, deliberately aimed at our service personnel, and it's my duty to protect them, and I will continue to do so.
Dixon.
I'd like to join the Prime Minister in thanking our armed forces who are protecting British citizens in the Middle East, and thank him on behalf of my constituents for his cool-headed leadership and firm decision not to join Trump's illegal war. Could he reassure my constituents worried about the cost of energy that he's doing everything within his power to secure peace, to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, and to ensure consumers are protected against rocketing energy prices?
Can I give her that assurance? That's what we've been doing particularly intensely in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll continue to do it later this week when President Macron and I host the summit together.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Going further and faster on renewables is entirely compatible with new licences in the North Sea. And my constituents can see that the Prime Minister has very little power to reopen the Straits of Hormuz and total power to order Jackdaw, Rosebank and new licences in the North Sea. How can he stand there and say that energy independence is the goal while he desperately tries to get oil and gas from elsewhere, which he can do little about, and refuses to overrule his insane Secretary of State for Energy and make sure that we produce, I withdraw that, Madam Deputy Speaker, the crazy policies of the Secretary of State for Energy, who insists on not producing it here. It makes no sense. Prime Minister, get a learning, get a teaching, but make sure it's not with him.
Well, as I say, oil and gas is part of the mix for many years to come. Decisions on Jackdaw and Rosebank, according to the legislative procedure, that's the right way to do it. We could legislate, it'd probably take longer. Mr. Speaker, they'll be part of the mix, but the long term, the only way to get energy independence is to go further and faster on renewables, and that's what we're doing.
Harry Gardner.
Japan, Turkey, China and India have already been in negotiation with Iran to try and secure safe passage for their vessels through the Straits of Hormuz. The Prime Minister was absolutely right to visit the Gulf states and their leaders, but he knows the importance of the Straits to those economies. Did he receive any assurance from them that they would not try and negotiate with Iran to salvage their own economies, because any tacit acceptance by them of the right of Iran to control the Straits would set a terrible precedent and empower Iran's leverage towards its nuclear ambitions?
Can I assure him on that front, because this came up in all the conversations I had, and there's absolute clarity amongst all the leaders that I spoke with, that there mustn't be any conditions, mustn't be any tolls, or anything that increases the chokehold in relation to the Strait of Hormuz. In relation to that strait in particular, very important to the Gulf, but also we fought for the principle of freedom of navigation for many, many years, and for good reason.
Manuela Pertegella.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the beginning of Trump's illegal war in Iran, we witnessed the bombing of the school, which killed at least 168 people, including 110 children. So, can the Prime Minister tell the House whether the UK government has agreed a no-strike list of civilian infrastructure that must not be hit by US planes launching missions from UK military bases?
Let me be really clear about that, because there must be a lawful basis for anything we do, and that includes what happens from our bases, which is why we've been very clear about the use of the bases and why we're monitoring the use of the bases on the terms that we set out.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since we last met in this place, the President of the United States has had at least 3 positions in relation to the Strait of Hormuz. First of all, he said that it was not in his interest because the US didn't need it and didn't use it. Then he speculated that actually it might be a good idea to have tolls on ships passing through the Strait with Iran in a joint venture. And now today he is overseeing a blockade. Given those incredibly erratic comments, can I commend the Prime Minister for his consistent and calm leadership, which stands in such clear contrast? And can I ask the Prime Minister if he agrees with me that ultimately this conflict will be concluded not by posts on social media, but by patient and persistent diplomacy?
Well, can I agree with him? And I think that is precisely why we're pursuing that patient diplomacy, which is an essential first step to getting the Strait open, and we'll continue to do so.
Alan Johnson. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister about food security. In response to an earlier question, he suggested that the answer to food security was to have further and faster on renewable energy. But does he recognise that carpeting some of the country's best, indeed some of the world's best farmland in Lincolnshire in solar panels is counterproductive to that aim?
Right. Prime Minister.
I don't think it's counterproductive, but just to be really clear, the most important thing on food security is getting the de-escalation and the Strait of Hormuz open. And that's why we're convening a number of countries, have been for the last 2.5 weeks, and will do again later this week, to operate at all levels to try and get that done as quickly as possible. I understand the impact on the farmers in her constituency and across the United Kingdom, and that is why we have to have that absolute focus in the work that we're doing.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today. He will know that Yom HaShoah, a Jewish commemoration of 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, begins tonight. We must never forget. But as this powerful memorial begins, Benjamin Netanyahu continues to flout international laws by bombing innocent civilians in Lebanon and intimidating Palestinians in the West Bank under the cover of the US-Iran situation. So what can the UK do to support the victims of Netanyahu and stop his ongoing destructive actions in all areas?
Well, I thank her for her question. That's why it's so important that we stay anchored in our principles and our values, foremost of which is that any action that we take or support must have a lawful basis.
Brendan O'Hara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, following his ill-conceived illegal war in Iran, President Trump has now sent the US Navy to block the Straits of Hormuz. Already this year, Trump has unlawfully invaded Venezuela and has threatened to annex Greenland, invade Cuba and quit NATO. He even accused UK troops and those of our allies of cowardice before launching an unprecedented attack on the integrity of Pope Leo. Clearly, there is nothing sacred or off-limits to this man, yet there was not a single mention of Donald Trump in the Prime Minister's statement. So given the catalogue of illegality and bullying, does the Prime Minister still believe that President Trump is a stable, reliable and trustworthy ally?
Yeah. Can I remind him that every day we work with the US on defence, security and intelligence sharing. The intelligence, when I say the US administration, the US, I mean President Trump, he is the president, yes. We share intelligence on a daily basis. That intelligence, that safeguards many people in all countries across the United Kingdom. And it would be foolhardy, in my view, to give up that co-work that we do, which is vitally important and safeguards the lives and interests of so many people in this country on a daily basis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the PM for his statement today. The disruption in the Strait of Hormuz is having a real and growing impact on ordinary working people across the world and in my constituency of Blackpool South, who many are already struggling to make ends meet, something the Prime Minister and I discussed a few weeks ago when we met. So can the Prime Minister update the House and my constituents in Blackpool South what steps he is taking to resolve this issue as quickly as possible?
Yes, and I know this will be of interest to his constituents, many of whom are worried by what they're seeing on their screens, but also the knowledge that it may impact them on the cost of living. And I can assure them that that is the reason that we are working with allies to seek de-escalation, to get the Strait of Hormuz open. That isn't a remote issue, it's an issue which affects them, their cost of living and the bills in their households, and that is uppermost in my mind as I take these actions.
Lee Dillon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Lebanese Health Ministry earlier today confirmed 2,055 civilians have been killed since the start of this latest crisis, including 167 since Friday alone. So I join the Prime Minister in calling for that urgent ceasefire to include Lebanon. But also, since this crisis has started, the Treasury have received over £200 million in additional VAT from fuel. So will the Prime Minister commit to using those funds here in the UK to mitigate the cost of living crisis that the crisis is causing?
On Lebanon, his question underlines again why it's so important that Lebanon is included in the ceasefire. And of course, we're looking across the board at all contingencies in relation to the support that we can put in.
Lizzie Collins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents are absolutely horrified by the civilian toll of US, Israeli and Iranian military attacks, including threats to basic civilian infrastructure. They're also very concerned about the long-term domestic impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, for example, on food prices. So firstly, can the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that UK bases will never be used to target civilians or civilian infrastructure? And secondly, can you reassure them that the government is planning for all possible domestic impacts?
Let me give that assurance on both fronts. And they're both very important points, and I give that assurance.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Oxfam has warned that the Gaza playbook is being repeated. The Israeli military is demolishing villages in south of Lebanon, displacing over 1.3 million people, killing over 2,000 and injuring over 6,400 people. Prime Minister, journalists are being killed by the Israelis. NGOs are being killed by the Israelis. The United Nations peacekeepers are being targeted by the IDF. So it's all good and well for the Prime Minister to say it's wrong. Can I ask what he's going to actually tangibly do to stop Israel's war machine in its tracks this time, and do what he failed to do during the genocide in Gaza, and say no to Israel and say no to Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, he's right. The attacks are wrong, and it's important that we are clear on that. Lebanon should be included in the ceasefire, and we're clear on that. We need to work with our allies to follow through on both of those propositions.
Jane Kirkham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to send my thanks and thoughts to our military personnel, particularly the Cornish Merlin, that's supporting our jets to defend British citizens since the Saturday after the conflict started. The Straits of Hormuz issue has underlined the massive importance of energy independence in this country. Can the Prime Minister outline how we're seeking to solve that crisis in the short, medium and the long term, particularly considering the wealth of natural resources we have in critical minerals and energy in Cornwall?
Can I just underscore the point she makes about the wealth in terms of that capability in Cornwall? And we do, in relation to renewables, need to go further and faster to make sure that we get energy independence. And that is important for her constituents and constituents across the country.
Hey, Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The manufacturing businesses that I visited my constituency recently are clear about the importance of both the availability and affordability of energy. The longer business waits for a plan, the worse the damage will be, as investment plans are postponed and other costs are cut. So when will the government act to support businesses, particularly in energy-intensive sectors like manufacturing, hospitality and farming?
Well, we have taken action in relation to particularly energy-intensive businesses. I recognise that those that fall without that, outside that protection, are extremely concerned. The most important thing we can do for them is to reduce the cause of the energy prices going up, and that is to de-escalate the situation and get the Strait of Hormuz open, because that's the cause of the energy prices going up.
Jonathan Davis.
Deputy Speaker,
The brutal Iranian regime is utterly appalling, but that is not a statement which is necessarily true of its ordinary citizens. So can I thank the Prime Minister for calling out President Trump's words about obliterating a generation. Now, the conflict has brought a civilization. The conflict has brought our energy security into sharp focus, which is why today's announcement, the £600 million deal with Rolls-Royce for small modular reactors, is so important. It's good for the country and it's good for jobs for my constituents in Derby. So can I ask the Prime Minister to work further and go farther to ensure that the small modular reactor programme is expanded and that it's brought to support our grid at pace?
Can I thank you for raising that? The Rolls-Royce project is hugely important. I'm very glad that we're able to announce it today because that is the first of the SMR projects, and it's really important that we take full advantage of projects like that.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the threat that the Iranian regime and its terrorist proxies in Lebanon present to world peace and in the Middle East and beyond, does the Prime Minister not accept that action against that regime was inevitable to cut back their military ability and also their ability to blackmail the rest of the world through illegally stopping an important waterway? It has economic consequences for our own country, but would you accept that, given the additional tax revenue which the government has brought from the increased fuel prices, that there is room to give extra support and in the longer run, of course, extract our own oil and resources, get the tax from that and have a secure supply which can't be interrupted?
Can I thank him? And look, the nuclear capability and the development thereof and the proxies is a threat, of course, that has to be dealt with. And the question is how that is dealt with. I've made my decisions based on the twin questions of whether any action that we take is got a lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. And those are the principles that have guided me. But it doesn't take away from the fact that those threats are there and we have to deal with them in the most effective way possible. And of course, we need to look at the support that we can put in for both businesses and individuals who are impacted by this conflict.
Josh Fenton-Glynn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I commend our ongoing refusal to be drawn into this conflict? And can I ask the Prime Minister what steps we're taking to ensure that UK bases aren't used for offensive operations and furthermore won't be used for any ill-advised US blockade, which would be economically ruinous of the Strait of Hormuz?
Can I thank you for that question? The bases are strictly for defensive purposes, and we monitor that in order to make sure that that is and remains the case.
Brian Matthew.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for his comments on Lebanon. We're seeing an Israeli military playbook from Gaza, collective punishment, forced displacement and attacks on health being used in Lebanon without meaningful action from the UK government. Will the Prime Minister please outline the specific steps his government will take to ensure an end to Israel's chronic immunity and impunity? Thank you.
Well, in relation to Lebanon, I think the immediate focus has to be on ensuring the ceasefire does extend to Lebanon. That is crucially important. Obviously, there's some diplomacy going on at the moment, but we need to keep that firmly in mind and work with others, not only on the question of Lebanon, but on accountability, which goes with the principle that any action should have a lawful basis.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for his leadership on this? Unlike certain other world leaders, it's clear that he recognises the consequences that international crises have on the cost of living at home. My constituents are feeling that every time they go and fill up the car. And that's further made galling by the fact that in Bracknell, fuel is between 2 and 10p more expensive than in neighbouring towns. What conversations has the government had with the Competition and Markets Authority and the sector at large to clamp down on this obvious unfairness?
Well, I thank you for his question, and I'm absolutely conscious of the impact this is having on fuel and therefore people in his constituency and across the country. We are working on a number of fronts. One, to make sure there's absolutely no profiteering from this in relation to the price discrepancies, but also to ensure that we de-escalate the situation, get the Strait of Hormuz open, which will be the most effective way to get those prices down again, which will impact on everybody filling up their cars.
Jim Allister.
The Prime Minister knows that his government's coffers have been swollen by hundreds of millions by the extra, particularly VAT tax take on rising fuel prices. Would it therefore be unreasonable to expect a socialist government to practice some redistribution of wealth from government to hard-pressed vehicle users, farmers, businesses who are being crippled by the price hike in fuel? And today, surely, he can give some light to consumers by saying that instead of anticipating a restoration, an increase in fuel duty, he will announce a decrease in fuel duty.
Well, we are looking at all contingencies. It's important that we do so, and we will continue to do so, mindful of the impact that he points out in his question. But there's no getting away from the fact that it is de-escalation and getting the Strait of Hormuz open that is the single most important thing that we need to focus on at the moment.
Jim Dixon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for the positive steps that the UK is taking to promote a negotiated settlement to the war and reassurance to shipping post-settlement through the Straits of Hormuz. But it is clear that the war, even thus far, will have a significant impact on British consumers. The Prime Minister has talked about very welcome measures to support residents with energy bills, and they'll be welcomed by my constituents in Dartford. But would he consider additional measures to support those who are most vulnerable, those on the lowest incomes, with the cost of living going forward as a result of the impact of this war?
Yes, we are considering what further support that we can put in place, and bearing in mind that de-escalation is the single most effective thing we can do.
I'm no better.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The impact of this conflict is horrific for those in the line of fire. It is also having a creating significant financial distress for residents and businesses right across these isles. The Prime Minister stated that energy bills have gone down from the 1st of April. For tens of thousands of my constituents who rely on kerosene and LPG, that is not true. For tens of thousands of my constituents that use petrol and diesel to access essential services many miles from their home, that is not true. Will he correct the record on that? And will he also tell us when he is actually going to do something to help those households that are in distress?
And he'll know that we, in addition to bringing household energy bills down by £100 from April until the end of June, we also announced the support putting in for oil, those that use oil to heat their homes. We need to look more closely across the board.
Ayub Khan.
Deputy Speaker, President Trump told the world that this was about liberating the Iranian people. But you don't liberate people by murdering 165 Iranian children in this illegal attack. And what we are witnessing now is an absolute madness where Donald Trump seeks to implement collective punishment, not just on Iranians by closing the Strait of Hormuz, but the wider global community, including British families that are seeking a price rise in fuel, food, and utilities. So when will this Prime Minister build the courage and strength to state that the attack and the continued action is illegal under international law? And if he seeks to prevaricate, doesn't it just show how weak and embarrassing this government's become?
We're one of the countries that are pulling together a coalition to deal with the impact of this by de-escalating the situation and seeking to get the Strait of Hormuz open. That is the most important thing for his constituents, for my constituents and people across the country.
Andrew George.
Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all, I'd like to associate myself with remarks of the Honourable Member for Tyrone, Falmouth with regard to the Cornish Merlin helicopters from RNS Culdrose in my constituency. The Prime Minister knows he has the full support of all the House when he says that he wants Lebanon included in the ceasefire, but surely he must accept that he can do a great deal more by, first of all, ensuring that no UK arms components ends up in the hands of the genocidal Netanyahu government, and secondly, by ensuring that there is absolutely no trade with the illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories.
I thank him for that, and as he knows, we've taken measures on both of those fronts in relation to the framework of law that we have in place.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, I think it's important we do recognise the Prime Minister's efforts in the Middle East to try and find a way forward. It's incredibly difficult and it should be recognised. There have been fuel protests in the Republic of Ireland just in the last week. Similar protests are planned for Northern Ireland and this week coming in. Last Friday, I spoke to the Ulster Farmers Union and some of the farmers expressing concern about the rise in the price of red diesel and also fertiliser. On the Saturday in Portavogie, the fishing sector told me they were concerned about the rise in diesel in their boats as well. And the HDV spoke to me last Friday and Saturday to express the same thing. Republic of Ireland have given some €5 million, 4 million sterling every day for the next 13 weeks to help those sectors. If they can do it, Prime Minister, please do the same for us in Northern Ireland and do it across us whole United Kingdom.
Looking across the board at what support can be put in place and looking at all the contingencies. But there's no escaping the fact that if we don't do the international work to de-escalate and get the Strait open, then we're fighting an uphill battle, which is why we have to convene those countries and try to resolve what's a very challenging situation.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If I may join the Prime Minister in recognising and commending Pakistan's efforts to facilitate dialogue in the pursuit of peace. It is, however, regrettable that a resolution has not yet been secured. I therefore ask the Prime Minister, what assessment has he made of the breakdown in US and Iran talks, of Israel's role in the collapse of those talks, and of the ongoing strikes in Lebanon? And will he condemn this continued hostility, which is creating a fresh humanitarian crisis in a region already torn apart by Israel's genocide of the Palestinians? And finally, does the Prime Minister acknowledge that it is long overdue that Israel's aggression in that region be forced to stop through sanctions and cutting of diplomatic ties?
In relation to the talks, as I mentioned earlier, I spoke to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on Friday ahead of the talks. We've been in touch again since the talks broke down about the very issue he raises, which is the prospect of still trying to find a way forward. And we will work with the Prime Minister of Pakistan and others to try and ensure that we get that diplomacy as far as we can, de-escalate the situation in that way.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement this afternoon. I'll allow a couple of moments for the front benches to swap over. Brings us to a statement from the Home Secretary on the Southport inquiry. Home Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I would like to make a statement on the Southport inquiry. I must thank all who participated in the inquiry and the Chair, Sir Adrian Fulford, and his team. Today, Sir Adrian published the report of the inquiry's first phase. This summer, the Government will provide a full response. This will also cover Lord Anderson's Prevent review. Today, I will provide the Government's initial reaction to an inquiry that exposes a series of tragic failures from which we must learn. We do so in the shadow of the events of the 29th of July 2024. I will not name the perpetrator, nor dwell on the details of the crimes that saw 3 beautiful young girls murdered, the attempted murder of 8 other children and 2 adults, and lasting physical and psychological harm to many more. I know I speak on behalf of the whole House when I say my thoughts today are with all those affected. Yeah. In honour of them and the memory of 3 murdered girls, Elsie Stancoom, BB King and Alice de Silva Aguiar, we must now act to prevent similar attacks. It was for that reason that my predecessor appointed Sir Adrian Fulford to lead a full statutory inquiry. The inquiry's work has 2 parts. The first, which reported today, considered the decisions made by the agencies and services that interacted with the perpetrator. This included a range of institutions within the criminal justice system, as well as education, healthcare, and local government. It also considered the actions of the perpetrator's parents. The findings of the inquiry are unsparing. Sir Adrian has uncovered systematic failures across multiple public sector organisations. The recording and sharing of information was poor. None of the agencies involved had a full understanding of the risk that the perpetrator posed, and many did not take steps to assess the risk that he posed to others. There was a failure by the agencies involved to take responsibility, and nobody was clear as to who was in charge. So the failure, because it belonged to everyone, belonged to no one. Where individuals missed opportunities to intervene, lessons must be learnt. But they did so within organisations that repeatedly passed the risk to others and where systemic failings existed. The perpetrator came into contact with the state on countless occasions. Lancashire police responded to 5 calls to his home address. The police were called when he was in possession of a knife in a public place. He was referred on several occasions to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. He came into contact with children's social care, the early help service, and children's mental health services. He was referred to Prevent on 3 occasions. He was convicted of a violent assault and referred to a youth offending team. All failed to identify the risk that the perpetrator posed, and so he fell between the gaps. The warning signs were missed, a growing history of violence, and a clear and continuing intent to commit harm. In the Home Office, the focus falls on prevent and policing. Sir Adrian is clear that police should have progressed the perpetrator to the multi-agency Channel programme. Channel could have actively assessed and managed his risk. Instead, he was not deemed suitable because he had no fixed ideology. This ran counter to the guidance at the time, but the thresholds were unclear and the guidance was applied inconsistently. The perpetrator's multiple referrals were also considered individually when they should have been seen as a cumulative and compounding risk. The perpetrator did not receive the correct interventions, and his autism diagnosis meant that professionals focused far too much on his vulnerability and far too little on the threat that he might pose to others. The horrific attack was itself evidence of the ease with which it could be concluded. There was no restrictions to stop the perpetrator from watching the violent content that inspired him, nor downloading instructions to make poison, nor viewing terrorist materials online. He was also able to bypass the safeguards that should have stopped him from buying and receiving dangerous weapons. These findings are devastating, but they are not surprising. Findings like these have been heard in inquests and inquiries before. This time, however, they must be a spur for change. The inquiry makes 67 recommendations. The government is reviewing these and will respond to those which relate to national government this summer, and I expect local agencies to do the same. Since this awful crime, the government has already acted, and that begins with Prevent. Since the Southport attack, the Home Office and counter-terrorism policing have reviewed historical cases to ensure that similar instances were handled correctly, with cases reassessed for any change in risk and managed accordingly. This government has reviewed the Prevent thresholds and published updated guidance. We've introduced a new Prevent assessment framework with mandatory training for counter-terrorism case officers. Oversight of repeat Prevent referrals has been strengthened, ensuring that cumulative risk is not missed and that senior sign-off is required before a case is closed. And to prevent independent oversight of the whole system, we created an independent Prevent Commissioner, and I would like to thank Lord Anderson for so ably taking on that position on an interim basis. His term ends today, and I am pleased to say that I've appointed Tim Jakes as the new Prevent Commissioner, who begins his role tomorrow. This government has also begun to place greater controls on a dangerously unregulated online world. The Online Safety Act requires companies to remove illegal content from their platforms. The Act is intended to limit children from encountering content that is legal but poses a risk of significant harm. But this is just the beginning of what can and must be done. The internet remains a dangerous place for children, and we are clear that tech companies have a moral responsibility to keep their users safe. But have no doubt that when they fail to do so, this government will intervene, which is why the government is consulting on whether to remove children's access to social media entirely. I can also announce today that we will legislate to prevent the spread of extreme violent content online. We've also made it harder for people to purchase weapons. The Crime and Policing Bill places new controls on the online sale and delivery of knives. We have banned the manufacture, purchase and possession of ninja swords and zombie-style machetes. And earlier this year, we published new guidance mandating that any child caught with a knife must be referred to a youth offending team. In the aftermath of the attack, the government commissioned Jonathan Hall KC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, to consider the legislative gaps exposed by this attack. This identified an inconsistency that clearly needed addressing. Unlike terrorist attacks, if you are planning an attack without an underlying ideology, there is no crime on the statute book. Jonathan Hall therefore recommended the creation of a new offence, and this legislation will also be brought forward as soon as parliamentary time allows. But the inquiry also identifies a wider issue. There are rising numbers of young men who are fascinated by extreme violence, boys whose minds are warped by time spent in isolation online. And this is a risk to us all. Where someone is vulnerable to terrorism, they can and should be managed through the PREVENT programme. However, where they are not, there is no clear approach to that risk. Today, we publish the terms of reference for the second part of the Southport inquiry, and it will face directly into this challenge. Sir Adrian will provide recommendations on the adequacy of existing arrangements across all arms of the state for identifying and managing the risk posed by violence-fixated individuals. He will explore what specific interventions are required to reduce the risk to the public. He will also review the influence of the internet and social media and the ease with which weapons can be procured. Sir Adrian begins this work immediately and will present his final recommendations next spring. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the summer of 2024, an act of unspeakable evil took place in Southport. Nothing will ever heal the pain of those who survive, including the families who suffered unimaginable loss. Responsibility rests with the perpetrator. There was also responsibility within the family. The perpetrator's parents knew the risk he posed, but did not cooperate with the authorities. And there is also responsibility on the state and on all of us here to learn the lessons from failures wherever they occurred. And the lesson is that the failures happened everywhere. We must ensure we do not find ourselves here again, grieving deaths which should never have happened had the state and those who worked within it acted differently. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is our task, and I commend the statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. Let us remember the three victims of this savage attack: BB King, aged just 6, Elsie Dot Scancombe, aged 7, and Alice da Silva Aguiar, aged 9, and 8 more children and 2 adults who were seriously injured. I also want to thank Merseyside Emergency Services who responded to this event. As the Home Secretary quite rightly said, this report identifies very serious, repeated failings by public bodies. Sir Adrian said, and I quote, "A merry-go-round of referrals, assessments, case closures and handoffs meant no agency took the lead or properly addressed the danger Rudder Kubana posed. Multiple opportunities were missed to prevent this tragedy." Sir Adrian also found Rudder Kubana's parents created, quotes, "significant obstructions to constructive engagement." Sir Adrian makes important recommendations. I'm glad the Home Secretary will respond by the summer, and we on this side of the House will support necessary actions. During the inquiry, we heard evidence given by Rudder Kubana's former head teacher, Joanne Hodson. She told the inquiry she was pressured by mental health services to water down the EHCP to minimise the danger posed by Rada Kobana because of his ethnicity. Miss Hodson told the inquiry this, and I quote verbatim, "My efforts to include this information in the EHCP were met with hostility by the father and also by mental health services. Miss Steed, who was from CAMS, even went as far as to accuse me of racially stereotyping AR as a black boy with a knife. Nothing could be further from the truth. But in the end, the wording of the EHCP was rewritten in many places." That's the end of her verbatim quote. Madam Deputy Speaker, this contributed to the clear risks being missed. The Nottingham inquiry into the 3 tragic murders there identified exactly the same issue. Mental health professionals in Nottingham decided not to section Valdo Calicone because they were concerned about, and again I quote verbatim, an over-representation of young black males in detention. And the government's own notes accompanying the King's speech on the mental health bill even refer to this issue as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, the fixation with ethnic disproportionality is deeply damaging. Ethnicity should never be a consideration when an agency is taking steps to protect the public. Everybody should simply be treated exactly the same. We cannot allow dangerous individuals to avoid detention for public safety simply because of their ethnicity. Everybody should be treated the same. I think it would be helpful if the Home Secretary makes clear from the dispatch box that she agrees with that approach and sets out how the government will change their approach in the future. Today's report also makes clear that Rada Kobana's autism was wrongly allowed to inhibit the way he was dealt with. Yet the government's King's speech notes the mental health bill again expressly says people with autism should be sectioned less often. Given the findings of today's report, will the government reconsider that? I also want to raise the aftermath of this tragedy, which saw serious rioting. It is, of course, important to avoid prejudicing criminal trials. However, as Jonathan Hall, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said, and I quote, "The government has to be aware that if there is an information gap, other voices, particularly on social media, will try to fill it." He went on, "Quite often, there's a fair amount that can be put into the public domain, and indeed, in October, 2 or 3 months after the attack, but well before the trial, information concerning the Al-Qaeda terror manual and ricin was put in the public domain without prejudicing the trial." So I think the failure to provide information did create an information vacuum in those early days of August 2024, and that vacuum was filled by untrue speculation online, some of it originating outside the UK, which fueled the riots. So having regard to that, will the Home Secretary commit to making sure such information is routinely released in cases of public interest in the future? Madam Deputy Speaker, as the mother of Elsie said at the inquiry, this tragedy must be a line in the sand. We owe it to the victims, to the survivors, and to their families to learn the lessons from this tragedy and to make sure it never happens again.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me say I welcome the Shadow Home Secretary's comments about potentially working together on the changes that need to be made as a result of the initial findings of the inquiry. The government will respond by the summer, and I look forward to discussions with him and with others in this House to make sure that the House is united as one in the action that needs to be taken. As he says, that is the very least that we owe the victims' families and all those who've been affected by this horrific tragedy. Let me just say on the issue of Mrs. Hodson, the head teacher, whose specific testimony he referred to, Shift Force gave evidence, and I believe that the position that she took was vindicated very strongly by the chair in the findings of the inquiry. Let me be absolutely clear. The only factors that should be taken into account are the potential risk posed by an individual and how best to manage that risk. No other factors are relevant, and it is clear, not just in relation to the experience that Mrs. Hodson had, but actually the failures that existed across a multiplicity of public agency. There was a failure to appropriately assess the risk that the perpetrator posed to others, which was at the heart of the problem, and that is how he managed to slip through the cracks because no one agency took responsibility for the assessment of that risk and ultimately for the managing of the risk that the perpetrator posed to others. Those are the only factors that should ever be taken into account, and I will be working closely with government ministers from other departments as we formulate our full response to the findings by the inquiry and setting out what our expectations are of professionals, not just in health but in other public services as well. Let me also say on the diagnosis of autism, Sir Adrian in his report did make it clear that it would be wrong to make a general association between autism and increased risk of violence to others. But he also found that in the perpetrator's case, the way his autism manifested did increase the risk of harm that he posed to others. And it does show the absolute importance of taking a case-by-case approach and making sure that all factors are adequately taken into account and that agencies take responsibility for how that risk is going to be managed. And again, there are good lessons to learn from this for health practitioners and for others in our local services when it comes to both assessment of risk, but also ultimately for how it is best managed. Let me say to him on the issues relating to the communications post the attack taking place, especially at a point where there was a lot of misinformation that was being spread, particularly online. He will know that there has already been a change in practice, learning the lessons of what happened then. There was, of course, a well-meaning desire to make sure that nothing was done that might prejudice a future trial, but exactly how the rules are applied, I think, can be a matter of interpretation and degree. The College of Policing has already created new professional practice in its guidance for police officers. There is already now a new CPS, that is to say the Crown Prosecution Service and media protocol, and we are developing a new charter between criminal justice agencies and the media to make sure that whatever information can readily and easily be made available is done so at the earliest opportunity. It will always be incredibly important that nothing is done that might prejudice a future trial, but I know he will acknowledge that since this horrific attack, there's already been a change in approach to comms, and the government and other agencies have already, in other instances and in other cases, been making much more much more information available to the media and ultimately, therefore, to the public. Let me just say, in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that the findings of the inquiry and also when Phase 2 reports will be of great interest to members across the whole House, and I do look forward to working not just with the official opposition but with all parties to make sure that the House is as one in the response to this horrific tragedy. That is what we owe all of the victims of this case.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Home Secretary's statement this afternoon. My constituents expect Prevent to keep them safe. So can she reiterate what changes she will be making as Home Secretary in this government to prevent, to help stop an attack like this again in the future?
Thank you. My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point on the reliance that all of us place upon the Prevent programme, that we should rightly be able to place on that programme to make sure it is as strong as it is possible to be in preventing tragedies and diverting people away from potentially committing a terrorist act and driving them away from extremism more broadly. We have already been delivering a number of improvements to the Prevent programme. There is new statutory guidance, there's improved training, new case management systems, much stronger interventions for people who are already on the programme, and a strengthened approach to managing repeat referrals. So where you've got a number of referrals which individually might have not led to an onward referral to the channel stream, the cumulative impact is now already being taken into account. There is also now a much more robust risk assessment tool, and I think the totality of the changes that we've already made have put the programme in a much stronger position. But of course, learning the findings from this inquiry, we will take more action as necessary.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement.
To know that there were so many missed opportunities to stop the Southport attack is truly heartbreaking. And my thoughts today are with the bereaved families whose young daughters were so cruelly taken from them, and the many other victims who suffered unimaginable trauma that day. We owe it to them to make every attempt to prevent a senseless attack like this from ever happening again. And the report today lays bare that agency after agency failed to step up and take ownership of the risks that the perpetrator posed. There are monumental failures across a number of authorities: the police, Prevent, NHS mental health services, children's social care, youth offending services, and the perpetrator's parents. This is simply not acceptable. So can the Home Secretary please confirm how soon she plans to report back on whether the government will be accepting all 67 of the recommendations, and will she commit to providing Parliament with an update on progress every 6 months? Today's report exposes serious oversights also by online giants that allowed the perpetrator to collect an arsenal of weapons without effective age verification checks. Will the Home Secretary confirm whether the recently published knife crime strategy will address the ease with which knives are available for purchase online and crack down on those big tech companies like Amazon who are putting profit above protocol when it comes to the sale of dangerous items? And finally, the Liberal Democrats have long argued that Prevent is not fit for purpose, and it is deeply shocking that the perpetrator was referred 3 times and yet no further action was taken. We understand that was because he didn't possess a specific ideology. Well, there should be no clearer sign of a system unable to address modern threats. So will the Home Secretary today commit to a full overhaul of Prevent within this Parliament, so that warning future signs aren't missed? And will she commit to bringing forward the legislation recommended by Jonathan Hall KC in the next King's Speech?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me thank the Liberal Democrat spokeswoman for her comments, and she's absolutely right. The sheer number of missed opportunities in this case is truly horrifying, and it's why we must do everything we can to reform all of these systems within our public services to make sure no such incident can happen again. Let me say to her, there will be a comprehensive response from the government on all of the recommendations made from phase 1 of the inquiry. I intend to do so before the summer, so the House will have an opportunity to debate that. And of course, as we move to delivery of the government's response to the recommendations, I will of course keep the House updated on our progress, including on where potential future legislation might also be needed. Let me say to her, in terms of the sale of knives in the Crime and Policing Bill, which is still continuing its passage through Parliament, we have introduced new age verification checks, both at the point of sale and also at point of delivery of knives, as a way of directly responding to some of the issues that we've seen in this case, where the perpetrator was able to slip through the system. That should not be possible in the future once the bill becomes an Act of Parliament and is implemented. Let me also say to her on the threat posed by those who are fixated by violence but who don't necessarily have an ideology, or who have a mixed ideology, or who flit into having an ideology and then not having one. There is a developing complex picture of the sorts of threats that we are facing. We've made it very clear that those who have no fixed ideology but are vulnerable to terrorism are still and should be referred to the Prevent programme. That remains the lead programme for dealing with the risk posed by those individuals. The inquiry recognises that there is a gap from those who do not have a fixed ideology, who are not vulnerable to terrorism, who might slip through. The phase 2 of the inquiry will consider how best to respond to those sorts of cases. We'll make recommendations on who should take the lead on dealing with those individuals. But I want to assure the Honourable Lady and all members in the House, the government is not simply waiting for phase 2 to report. We're already trialling with a number of local authorities a new approach for those who are below the threshold for Prevent, but who have a risk that we are concerned about, and where we believe that they might pose a risk of harm to others, to think about different ways in which agencies might handle that risk to make sure that those individuals don't slip through the net. And as we learn lessons from those pilots, we will seek to start implementing them, whilst we wait, of course, for Sir Adrian Fulford and the inquiry team to come forward with fuller recommendations on this later in the future.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. I'd like to place on record my sympathies to the families of Alice, Elsie and Bibi, who are living with the most unimaginable loss. The Southport attack has been ruled a disaster waiting to happen after the perpetrator was referred to prevent on 3 separate occasions, and other multi-agency failings have been highlighted by Sir Adrian Fulford. On the 20th of June 2020, my constituents, Gary and Jan Fairlong, lost their son James, who was murdered during the Forbury Gardens terrorist attack. I'm also thinking of them today, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like Southport, the perpetrator of the Forbury Gardens attack had been referred to prevent 4 separate times, and multi-agency failures were also highlighted by Sir Adrian Fulford. And like the deaths of Alice, Elsie and Bibi, the deaths of James Fairlong, Dr David Wales and Joseph Ritchie Bennis were ruled as probably avoidable. I acknowledge that it will take some time to go through the 67 recommendations that has been made in respect of Southport, but can the Home Secretary advise, despite the improvement she has outlined today in respect to prevent, does she actually believe that prevent is fit for purpose? And to quote the Home Secretary, Madam Deputy Speaker, from her statement, she said, "We must ensure we do not find ourselves here again, grieving deaths which should never have happened had the state and those work within it acted differently." But the fact is that we are here again, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we are here time and time again after multi-agency failures. So can she immediately take respect in respect of joined up partnership working and outline to us what those steps will be to ensure that no family has to endure such loss?
Home Secretary.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for what she has just said, and also associate myself with her remarks about the victims and the families of those who died in the Forbury Gardens attack. She is absolutely right. We have been here far too many times. This must be a moment of change. I'm very hopeful that with such a thorough report from Sir Adrian Fulford, with such clear practical recommendations for action to prevent such a tragedy occurring in the future, that we can and will make progress. And I do ask her, and I know she will accept that this is what we owe the families, and this is the very least that we owe all of the families. And I do look forward to working with colleagues across the House to implement recommendations as we move forward. We all have to do more, and government agencies all have to do more as well. Let me assure her that I'm standing up a task force to bring together all government ministers with relevant responsibilities to make sure that we are beginning work immediately on improving the systems and the processes that are in place at the moment, and that we're not still simply waiting for the final phase of the inquiry to report. So there will be more progress. We have taken steps on reforming Prevent. I know that the Prevent strategy, the work that it does, has been of interest in this House for many years and has been scrutinised very thoroughly. Let me say to her, an intervention programme of this kind is always going to have to move very quickly to deal with changing threat patterns. So even if we just look at Islamist extremism, for example, the way that might have presented in the era of Daesh and ISIL in Syria, sort of becoming prominent, is different to how it presents now. And practitioners have to be able to adapt as quickly as the presentation of extremist ideologies is developing as well. So it will always be a work in progress. I think that is something that we should acknowledge, just because the nature of the threat is changing so quickly and so regularly. But we can and we will have strong mechanisms in place to make sure that it does the job that we all know it needs to do.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, as a consultant paediatrician, I have to undertake prevent training at regular intervals. And at each one of those occasions, I've raised with ministers my concerns about either the quality or the emphasis or both of this training. But I wonder if the Home Secretary could say whether she feels that in this particular situation, the problem was mostly that the perpetrator didn't conform to the usual patterns that people were being trained to spot, that people were being badly trained, that people were not using their training diligently, or that the actions, once a case had been reported, were not followed through. Which was the major factor, does she think?
Home Secretary.
Well, let me say to the Honourable Lady, I'll be happy to hear her personal experiences of the quality of that training. I think this is the first time she and I have had an interaction on this matter. I'll be very happy to pick those issues up offline. Well, let me say on the substance of her point, we must follow the findings of the inquiry chair, who said that there were 5 major failures here, that no single agency took ownership of the risk that the perpetrator posed, that there was poor information recording and management, but also that sometimes the behaviour was excused on the basis of his perceived or diagnosed autism spectrum disorder. So there are a range of factors in place. I think we should follow the evidence and the findings of the inquiry chair, and we will respond based on the failures that have been found.
Helen Hayes. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. All of our thoughts are today with the families of Alice, Phoebe and Elsie. They have already suffered the most horrific loss. To have confirmation today from Sir Adrian Fulford that their loss was preventable is utterly unbearable. Sir Adrian's report highlights the failure of the multi-agency safeguarding hub, exactly the place where joint responsibility between different agencies should have been held. And he also said that children's services were not well equipped to manage a risk presented by a young person as distinct from risks to a young person. Can I therefore ask the Home Secretary what plans she has to work with the Department for Education and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to ensure that as a matter of urgency, every professional working with high-risk young people knows exactly what to do when they are fearful that a young person is a risk to others and is accountable for taking that action?
Secretary. Well, my honourable friend notes one of the absolute key failures, which is on who the risk is to. And in this case, too much of the internal assessments were on the risk to the perpetrator himself and not on the risk that he posed to others. And that must change. There were practical recommendations from Sir Adrian Fulford for the individual agencies, but I think that it speaks to a need for a cultural shift, I think, in the way that these cases are looked at and managed. That will be a cultural shift for colleagues in the health department, in education, as well as in housing, communities and local government. Where a prevent referral is made because there is a vulnerability to terrorism, there are already systems in place that would enable those risk assessments to be made on the basis of risk posed to others. Of course, here it should have been made but was not made, the onward referral to Channel, as should have happened. But we have to make sure that even where the onward referral to Channel doesn't take place and somebody doesn't quite fit the threshold for prevent, that they are still picked up, and that cultural shift for management of risk, assessment of risk and dealing with it is taking into account all of the findings that Sir Adrian Fulford has made.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for the way she is promoting learning rather than blaming, because that is the best way to get the change we need, and for her very robust response to my right honourable friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, about the point he raised, and for the point she now makes about the requirement of a cultural shift. Can she take a close interest in this? Because not many leaders in many organisations understand that that means changing the attitudes and behaviours of individuals in their organisations. It's not just about setting a policy. And that requires a very concerted act of leadership and diligence and consistency, and making sure that those who don't want to make the change are eased out of their positions, and there are no promotions for those people who don't respect and demonstrate the changed attitudes and behaviours that are required. This is a big ask and doesn't often happen in the public service.
Home Secretary.
I thank the honourable gentleman. Let me say to him, it is a big ask, and I am very clear this must be a moment of change. I don't want to be standing here with a future tragedy saying the same things that have been said in response to what happened in Southport. We owe the families a true moment of change for the way that public services are delivered, and he is absolutely right. The cultural shift is absolutely critical to the ability to make onward progress here, whether that is agencies that don't normally consider risk posed to others because they're primarily concerned about the risk of harm a person poses to themselves and their clinical need that is different to a wider societal need to protect others from harm. And I do think that that is now something that we are going to have to look at very closely as a government and to bring forward real change within our health service, within education and within local government as well. Let me assure him and the House I will take a close personal interest, because at the end of the day, preventing harm and keeping our people safe is my responsibility. Where people meet the threshold for being dealt with through the prevent strategy and onward referral to channel, I will make sure we do everything we can to have those mechanisms as robust as possible. But where they are below that threshold, as a society, we still need an answer. And of course, I will take a very close interest in that myself.
Sarah Russell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the whole House's thoughts are with the family and, of course, mine are too. One of the many aspects of what has gone wrong here relates to children's mental health services. And could the Home Secretary please outline what we are doing about the workforce for children's mental health services, because there is a real shortage of people who are skilled in this area.
Home Secretary.
Yes, my honourable friend makes an absolutely important point. The government's obviously already taken steps to shore up the provision of mental health services within the National Health Services. I'm joined by colleagues from the Health Department today who I know are listening very closely and will be absorbing the findings that Sir Adrian Fulford has made in phase 1 of his inquiry. And I will be working with all ministers across government before we formulate our fuller response to all of the 67 recommendations, but let me assure her the provision of mental health services will be absolutely critical to the work the government does as a result of this inquiry.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary's statement confirms the core failure that when everyone was responsible, no one was accountable. And we have seen this pattern before. The same passing of the book in safeguarding, the same passing of the book in grooming gang cases and in mental health. We have heard today about reviews, frameworks and guidance, but not enforcement. So I'd be grateful if the Home Secretary could tell this House plainly, if recommendations are not followed to the letter, what consequences will follow?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right that, of course, it's one thing to bring about changes and to change professional practice, but of course these things should be enforced properly. When the government responds in full before the summer, in terms of our response to all 67 of the recommendations, I will lay out what our expectations are going forward. I think it's important to recognise Sir Adrian Fulford doesn't make individual findings of fact in terms of individuals and those failings, because there was such widespread system failure. So I do think it is right that in the first instance the government looks at the wider systems that we have in place. But of course, within those systems, ultimately, if there are failures and there are individual failures, there should be accountability.
Chris Vince.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for her statement today and her continued leadership on this issue. And can I join the whole House in sending my sympathies not only to the victims, to their families. This is absolutely a dreadful crime, and I'm sure any parent in the room, I am one, is rightly appalled by it. Having worked both in education and also in the charity sector, I saw an awful amount of buck passing when it came to mental health support and also safeguarding issues. And my view was always, if in doubt, report it. And clearly in this case, things have been reported, but they haven't been taken forward, which is hugely concerning. What can the Home Secretary do to ensure me that this buck passing, as mentioned by the member opposite, will stop and actually there will be accountability and people will be responsible for these issues?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises a really, really important point. He's absolutely right. The failure of any one organisation or group of individuals to take responsibility for the perpetrator is one of the key failures that has occurred in this case. What phase 2 of the inquiry will consider is what is the best mechanism for managing people who pose these sorts of risks going forward, and recommendations will be made about the proper structure that should be brought forward. I think where somebody meets the prevent threshold, prevent will remain the lead institution for referrals, and of course that referral and onward progression to the channel stream should have happened here, and if that had happened happened, then we would be in a different position today. But for those who don't fall within that threshold, we will need to have a wider system response. As I've said earlier, I am trialling in different local authorities pilots to look at different approaches for what you might do with those individuals who are below threshold. But in the end, I think Sir Adrian Fulford's work will give us the new framework and some guidance as to the best agency that should take the lead in different cases. Because I think when an agency takes the lead, there is an obvious sort of accountability, or even if they're convening all of the other agencies, which is how multi-agency safeguarding hubs should work, and sometimes do not. So those are, I think, the key areas that lessons need to be learned on.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. Does she plan to provide any additional resource or funding to the Prevent programme? And if so, does she have any initial idea as to where that may be targeted?
Home Secretary.
Let me say to the honourable gentleman, he raises an important point. When the government responds in full to the recommendations, I will set out any resource implications that there are, not just for the work of the Home Office, but for other agencies as well.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I join the Home Secretary in commending the bravery of victims in coming forward to give evidence to this inquiry? We owe it to them to make this a turning point, to make certain that the systemic failures and culture that made this attack possible are fixed and can never be repeated. Many of us in this House will recognise from the report the difficulties in accessing CAMs, the ambiguities in responsibility and massive under-resourcing of this vital service. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this moment calls for nothing less than a revolution in how children's mental health services are commissioned and resourced?
Secretary.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. There are, of course, recommendations for different government departments, including health, to take forward, and I will be working very closely with ministers from across government as we design our response to Sir Adrian's recommendations. But let me tell him on the issue of violence fixation, the descent into nihilism, and that fascination with extreme violence, that does demand a new public policy response from all of government, particularly for those children who wouldn't necessarily need to test for clinical need, but who absolutely do pose a risk of very serious harm to other people.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When I heard the news this morning and it was read out the catalogue of failures, missed opportunities, and the focus of attention that there was in this murder, and yet he was allowed to get off with it, my heart went out to the families of these three wee girls who could have avoided, and their murder could have been avoided, and yet it was missed. And time again in this House, over the time I've been here, I've heard individual child abuse cases, rape gangs, mass murder, and all on each occasion there was failure by public bodies and individuals in public bodies to prevent what could have happened. And unfortunately, and as has been highlighted here again today, there seems to be this attitude that, look, if there's colour or ethnicity involved in it, that's an additional factor and fear of racism. I welcome the assurances that the Secretary of State has given today. But what I would ask is, what steps, given how deeply this attitude is embedded in the public sector now, what steps does she intend to take to make sure that this does not happen again, and that those who are responsible for these decisions are held to account?
Secretary.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right. Reading the report of the inquiry, it's horrifying. It makes for incredibly difficult reading, and the recommendations are incredibly important. The government will respond in full by the summer, and will take forward practical work to make sure that we strengthen all of our systems to make sure this can't occur again. Just let me repeat, the only thing that matters, the only relevant factor when we have a person who is violence fixated, has a fascination with extreme violence, is the risk they pose, the assessment of that risk, and then the steps to take to mitigate that risk. No other factor should be taken into account by any agencies. The most important thing is we keep people safe and that we do not allow other irrelevant considerations to play any part. The inquiry made findings in relation to Mrs. Hodson, the head teacher, and I endorse, of course, and agree with the findings that Sir Adrian Fulford has made.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The
Home Secretary aware that there are 28 prevent priority areas across the country. There used to be 40. Stoke-on-Trent was one of them until 2023 when the last government changed the criteria. She'll know that to be a prevent priority area, you normally have to demonstrate either right-wing extremism as a hotspot or Islamist activity as a hotspot, or in the checkered past of my own city, both. If Jonathan Hall's legislative suggestions come into force and we are now having a new offence of non-ideological based fixation with violence, how does the Home Secretary see that playing into those prevent priority areas, given that the locality of that's going to be much more difficult to consider? And post the events in August 2022, when there were riots in Stoke-on-Trent, has the Home Secretary given any thought yet to whether or not any recommendations for where new funding should go to help deal with some of these issues should look at where there was rioting in August 2022, particularly in places like Stoke-on-Trent that don't currently qualify for prevent priority funding?
True.
My honourable friend raises a really important point. Let me say to him that once phase 2 of the inquiry has concluded, especially on the proper mechanism by which we deal with some of these violence fixated individuals, there will of course, I think, be knock-on consequences for the wider countering extremism system. It wouldn't be right for me now to get ahead of that, but let me assure him I'm very aware that, that both the current work of the inquiry but also the future work of the inquiry will require further clarity, I think, on exactly where responsibilities sit. Prevent as a programme will still, I believe, continue to play an incredibly important role. It will remain our main tool for countering extremism. I'm sure there will be more we can do to strengthen its ability to counter extremism, but there will be knock-on consequences in other parts of the system, including for funding as well. I will be able to set out more of the government's response on that when we respond in full to the inquiry's recommendations. But as phase 2 gets underway, I think that's where some of the real meat of the new policy responses that are needed for violence-fixated children, that's where that will come out.
Joy Morrissey. A young person who is at risk to harming others will often become known to a teacher, a social worker, a health worker before any other agency knows that this person is going to pose a risk. There are statutory requirements that make it very difficult to report on a young person if they are below a certain age. Will the Home Secretary clarify if